Test, test. All right. Shabbat shalom. Me too. Glad I didn't have to go to California. And who knows where else after that. Yeah, the whole thing is just a mess. I will let you know about that. It's a longer than a 20-second answer. If you started the stream. Shabbat shalom, and welcome to Midrash U for December 17th. It is the 23rd of Kislev, according to the reckoning of the rabbinics. And we are going to look this week and next week at the Maccabean Revolt and the origins of Hanukkah. And this will dovetail into some things that Rabbi Allen talked about last week as he was talking about the Antichrist. And we'll kind of go into some more details and some things that he kind of mentioned in brief, because the details become a little bit important to the understanding of Hanukkah. So we are going to be celebrating Hanukkah. The rabbinics celebrate Hanukkah from sundown on December 18th. That is Sunday night. And it will end when the sun goes down on December 26th. Now, that means that the first night of Hanukkah is December 18th, and the last night of Hanukkah is December 25th. Right? Remember, the Hebraic understanding of day starts when the sun goes down and proceeds through until the next sundown. Okay, so that last day of Hanukkah will truly be, the day part will be the 26th, and the final night of Hanukkah will be celebrated on the 25th. We will be celebrating that a little bit differently. We will be, and I thought I had that in there, let me look for that slide real quick. Here we go. We will be celebrating on Monday, December 26th, in order to allow people to celebrate Christmas. Of course, Hanukkah will have come to a close, but still we're going to celebrate both the Rosh Chodesh for the month of Tevet. That'll be actually the 3rd of Tevet. The 8th night of Hanukkah, we'll be celebrating that. We'll bring our Hanukkahs in. It's always a great time in the fellowship hall with the Hanukkahs lit up, and Hanukkah glasses, and it's just a great time. Turn out the lights and see all the brilliance of the lights that are there. Let's see if there was anything in that other slide. All right. So the question always comes up, how do you spell Hanukkah? And if you spell it in the Hebrew, you always spell it the same way, with a chet, a noon, a kaf, and a hay. However, if you're going to spell it in English, it's transliterated, and there are just a wide number of different ways to actually spell Hanukkah, either with a CH or an A at the beginning, or H at the beginning, either with a single N or a double N in the middle, either with a single K or a double K towards the end, and either with an A or an AH at the end, and any combination thereof. This is a transliteration, and so there are just more ways to spell Hanukkah than there are days, actually. So, to wish somebody a happy Hanukkah, Hanukkah Samek. Samek means happy. Chag Samek. Chag really doesn't mean holiday. It's come to mean that. It comes to mean, it's supposed to mean celebration. You will celebrate unto the Lord, is what we're told for his Moedim, and that word is Chag, right? So Chag Urim Samek, Happy Lights holiday. And again, as I mentioned before, we will be celebrating both Rosh Chodesh for the month of Tevet, and also Hanukkah, the end of Hanukkah, on Monday, December 26th. Meet us here at 6:30 in the fellowship hall, and we'll move into the sanctuary at 7 p.m. for our Rosh Chodesh celebration. All right, so it's important to understand what we're talking about when we start talking about Hanukkah and start talking about Maccabees and the Maccabean revolt. And people will say, well, where do I find the information for Hanukkah in the Bible? And the answer to that question is it depends on whose Bible you read. Okay, and that's because we have scripture that we have determined to be canonically inspired. Canonical means inspired by God, right? And we have the first canon, or the proto-canonical, and that's the Tanakh. Everybody agrees on the Tanakh, right? The 66, the books that we have that make up the Old Testament, right? And then we have the canonical, which is specifically the New Testament, okay? And the problem is that there are groups that also have deuterocanonical, or second canon, which they also considered inspired. And that becomes part of the issue. These deuterocanonical books by other folks are deemed to be apocryphal, meaning a hidden away meaning, and deemed as non-canonical by other groups, or they're called pseudepigraphia, meaning false inscription. And it's not so much that they're claiming the book is false, but a pseudepigraphia is a way for an individual to write a work and attribute it to somebody else in history. That's the pseudepigraphia part of it, not that what is being said is false, okay? And that was a very common thing that was done within the ancient culture. So, we may look at that and say, okay, that seems a little weird, although even today we have people who write under false names, right? And for various purposes. I can't remember, Stephen King writes also under Richard Bach or something like that, and there are others that do that. Okay, so how are we to really truly try to understand these things? So canon is, again, inspired by God. The proto-canonical is the Old Testament, the canonical is the New Testament, and then we have all of this basically coming out of the Septuagint. Okay, and that's probably the place that things start getting difficult. Okay, is that and we'll see a slide that kind of shows this a little bit later, but all of our versions of the Bible originate with the Septuagint. Period. End of story. Now, we have had other texts that were used to compare to the Septuagint, but it all comes from the Septuagint. And again, the shorthand for the Septuagint that you're going to see over and over again is LXX, which are the Roman numerals for 70, which is what Septuagint means. And the Septuagint had all the books of the Old Testament, but it had other works as well. And of those other works, some of them were considered second canon, deuterocanonical, and some of them were considered as non-canon, in which case, depending on who you talk to, they will start applying labels like apocryphal or pseudepigraphical. You may have a version of the King James that has the apocryphal in it, right? Those are these books, right? Only when it's done by the Protestants, all of those books that were contained within the Septuagint that were non-canonical, not Old Testament, are deemed to be non-canon works of man. They were supplied just for everybody, because that's what the scripture was going back to the time of the Jews, from the time of the Maccabees forward. Okay. All right. Well, depending on who you talk to, books either become canonical or they become non-canon. And therein lies the difficulty. So when we look at a timeline, and I know this is kind of a busy slide, but recognize that the Septuagint, the LXX, the Old Testament and these other works were the original manuscripts that upon which all of the various translations are going to be based. Because that was the extant Bible in the time of Christ. And when the New Testament comes into being, that is the version that is being used by everybody. Okay? Does that mean that there wasn't also scriptures, Old Testament and other works that were in Hebrew? No, it doesn't, because we have subsequently found pieces of those. Okay? But what was disseminated within the synagogue system across Israel and across the world was the language in which was what we would call today the lingua franca, right? And that term goes back to when French was used as the primary language that was spoken across all countries in order to allow everybody to communicate. The lingua franca now is English. If you fly an airplane into any airport in the world, English is spoken by the air traffic controllers to make sure that no matter where you're coming from, be it Italy, be it Belgium, be it the United States, be it Buenos Aires, wherever your flight originated from and wherever it goes to, everybody can communicate with words that everybody agrees what they mean, right? Koine Greek served this function back in the ancient world. And it was the language that allowed people to write letters and to enter into contracts between Spain and Greece or Spain and Egypt, and everybody knew what everybody meant because the language was settled as to what it meant. And you couldn't, like we do today, take the language and say, well, you know, we're going to make it fluid, and for me it means something different than what it means for you. Right? But you're going to have to accept my definition, right? The language was firm from that standpoint. So, the Septuagint is the basis upon which all these other variations of the Bible, and today in English we have probably 40 or 50 at this point. And these works that were either considered deuterocanonical or apocryphal, or both, depending on who you talk to, were included all the way up until 1885. And back that up 10 years, in Great Britain, the Great Britain Bible Society cut them out of their Bible in 1870 something, and about 10 years later in 1885, the American Bible Society did the same. And they dropped those books. And they dropped those books partially because there were things in them that were hard for them to wrap their heads around, and they were afraid that people, when we start talking about Baal and the dragon, right, that people said, well, there aren't any dragons, so that's all made up, and they were afraid that people were going to take things that they didn't understand there and apply it to the Bible in general and say we can just discard the book because there are things that we clearly don't understand. The sun standing still in the sky in the book of Joshua is another one of those places that people just skip over because they don't want to have to deal with the natural questions that come about from that. That is a discussion of another time. So all of the manuscripts, all of the Bibles that we have, notice that here in this area is all of these texts that then come out of the Septuagint. You have a question?
Authorized the interpretation into Greek?
Well, we will get to that, actually. That goes back to the time of the Seleucids, and we'll talk about that too, and because that time frame spans quite a long period of time, over 100 years, that they're in the process of translating the writings of the Jews into Greek. Okay, so notice that all of these are connected, and you see that the Septuagint and occasionally some other texts are the originators of all the other texts that we have, right? And when we look at this, and again, the other works, the apocryphal works, deuterocanonical works, the combination of those two get dropped out in the 1885 time frame. When you look at the Masoretic text, notice down here that the Masoretic text starts getting written in 500 AD and gets completed in 900 AD. Okay, so it is, and again, it's based upon Hebrew texts, right, but also upon the Septuagint to some degree. Remember, that was the text that the Jews had. All right, so you look at the Latin Vulgate, and the Latin Vulgate comes into being around 400 AD. And remember that at the time of Charlemagne, when the world is starting to turn the Roman Empire towards Christianity, right? The Latin Vulgate was the language of Rome, and what they did was they took all of these, and they said that there were about 500 different translations in people's languages and dialects, and they confiscated them and burned most of them in order to put out just a version of the Bible that was in the Latin, right? And the fear here, and the fear in the Reformation, is that if you don't do this, you will have as many different interpretations as you do people and people groups, right? And that was not an unreasonable charge. We have 43,000 different plus denominations as of like 5 years ago, I think it was now. So that's not an unreasonable charge. But notice that all of these things are much later than the Septuagint. Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, predate this, and they go back 300 or 400 years. Modern scholars were really excited about the Dead Sea Scrolls because it said, hoo-hoo, we got it, we got our smoking gun. We'll be able to show that all of the texts that we have that make up our Old Testament, particularly the book of Isaiah, which is so crucial for understanding who Yeshua is, who Christ is. They'll be able to show that was all fabricated after the fact, that in fact it had changed over time. And what they found out was that the only spots where they didn't have agreement is where they didn't really have text, where the scroll was missing that part and they couldn't say. Other than that, they basically had almost 100% agreement. And where they had disagreement, it wasn't in words, it was in letters used for vowels. So the ayin might be used instead of the aleph, or something similar to that. And in spelling variants that actually don't change the text, right? And that was quite the difficulty for them. Well, the question really arises, and the part of the reason that these other works, regardless of how you view them, get dropped out from the Bible going forward from about the late 1800s is because the Protestants said, you know what, those Catholic guys got books in there, the apocryphal books, and they got stuff that they say is canon, but we don't see it that way, because we didn't see it in the Hebrew text that we had that came through the Reformation. And frankly, we think that those things don't show up in the New Testament. And the charge was made that, well, the only things that show up in the New Testament are things that come out of the Old Testament. Okay, and that charge was made, and it was promulgated forth, but there's a guy by the name of Jimmy Akin who has been cataloging the deuterocanonical texts and where they are quoted in the New Testament. Okay? So let's look at that. All right. So we have stuff that is inspired by God. You have folks who say that the deuterocanonical texts are inspired by God. You have the New Testament. And again, this guy, Jimmy Akin, is the guy who has cataloged what quotes in the New Testament, where they come from. There's very, very few quotes out of the New Testament that are from original Hebrew. They're almost all from the Septuagint. Okay? So, Septuagint makes up the Old Testament and these deuterocanonical books. And when you look at the proto-canonical side of this, what everybody agrees is the Old Testament. There's 340 times that the New Testament quotes the Old Testament out of the Septuagint. Okay? Well, that's a lot of quotes. There's 332 times that the New Testament quotes the deuterocanonical texts that the Protestants say don't show up in the New Testament. 332. And notice that there's only 8 quotes difference between these two numbers, right? So you have almost half and half. I think you could say half and half for all practical purposes. And the total number of quotes from the Septuagint in the New Testament is 672. Okay, half of them being from the Old Testament, what we recognize as the Old Testament, and half of them being from the deuterocanonical books. Okay, so the argument that the Protestants make that it doesn't show up in the New Testament is objectively false. Okay, doesn't necessarily mean that we've met the criteria to include them as canon, but that charge that they don't show up in the New Testament is false. Well, when we look at and here we're just looking at the books of the Maccabees. Okay, there's other texts that are considered deuterocanonical, and you'll notice that the Oriental Orthodox, the folks from Alexandria, these would be your Coptic Christians, they consider 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees to be deuterocanonical, as do the Eastern Orthodox. The Ethiopian and Roman Catholics see 1st and 2nd Maccabees as deuterocanonical, but the 3rd and 4th Maccabees, and it's plus or minus for the Ethiopian Jews, as being something that is less than canonical, right? And so you have this disagreement, and when you drop into the Jewish side of things, the Jews don't recognize any of these books as being canon. The question becomes why? Okay. Likewise, our Protestant brothers and sisters, among whom I count myself, don't consider any of these books to be inspired by God, but consider them to be apocryphal. All right, and there's other deuterocanonical books that we're not going to go into since we're just looking at this. Remember that Martin Luther is a Catholic, was a Catholic, and considered himself a Catholic up until the day he died. All right, even though the Reformation hinges upon him and the 99 treatises, questions that he put to the church and said, this don't make sense, we need to talk about these things. And that's exactly what those 99 treatises were. Well, what about them not being in the Jewish canon? Right? That's a very reasonable question. Remember, the Masoretic text doesn't start getting written until like 500 AD. And it goes from 500 to 900 before it is completed. And the form that we have today dates back to that 900 time frame, the final versions that we had of the Masoretic text, 900 AD. almost 900 years after Christ walked the earth. Okay, well, you still have that question, well, why didn't they include them? If they didn't include them, then maybe that's a good reason for us not to include them. Well, there's a lot of things that you have to look at. That Septuagint starts getting written in 282 BC, approximately. And it spans all the way down to 132 BC before it's completed, right? And it's understood that the Septuagint is the birth of the synagogues, and the Septuagint was distributed for use in the weekly Sabbath worship. That was the variant of the Jewish writings that was used throughout the world, not just in Israel, but across the world. You know, when Peter says or James says that Moses is taught in all the cities, he's talking about all the cities of the world, letting the Gentiles go there to get their training, right? In chapter 15 of Acts, that's what he's pointing to. That they all had the same Bible, and it was the Septuagint. Okay. Well, the question still remains, why are they not included in the Tanakh? But they were included in the Septuagint. Well, this goes back to the siege of 70, and we don't have a clear answer. Nowhere is it written down that says, on this date, we decided that we were not going to include these books. And so there's a lot of subjection as to why this might be. And most of it's going to go back to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Okay, so you have the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Rome has come in. General Vespasian allows Rabbi Jonan ben Zakkai, he was the leader of the Pharisees. He allows him to leave the siege with all of their possessions. He allows them to set up a Jewish community under the protection of Rome in Yavne. And he allows them to open a new center for Judaism at that location to maintain the Sanhedrin. And they reconvene the Sanhedrin. Now the Sanhedrin had Pharisees and Sadducees. Oops. No, none of the Sadducees are allowed to leave Jerusalem. They're all going to die. The Sadducees will come to an end as a part of the people of Israel. They are going to cease to exist. But the Pharisees are going to continue. And in fact, the Pharisees are the root of the rabbinic Jews. Okay, so you've got this letter that allows the Pharisees to leave. And again, rabbinic Judaism begins at that point. And so the question becomes, okay, well, how come there's no Maccabees in the Masoretic text? And you have the Council of Jamnia, which is convened 20 years later, 90 AD. Okay, and you have again Yochanan ben Zakkai and others who formalized what is going to be in the Tanakh. Now, people have theorized, these are theories, that only Hebrew texts were included, but the book of Daniel is not in Hebrew, and it was included. You have a theory that says that the Council of Jamnia inherited a pre-existing list of recognized canon, but you can't find anywhere that appears to be true. All of the variants of the Septuagint that predated this era all had these books which we now call apocryphal. You have the political rivalry between the Sadducees, and the Sadducees were the Maccabeans. They were the Hasmoneans, right? They are the ones that assumed power, and they were in opposition to the Pharisees. And of course, the Sadducees are now dead for 20 years because they get killed off in the siege. And you have the Pharisees, of course, who are going to convene this Council of Jamnia. You have the reality that Rome rules, and they're ruling with an iron fist. And do you include books that inspire Jewish rebellion and autonomy against Rome when Rome has allowed you out of Jerusalem, has seen to your life and allowed you to set up this Center for Judaism in Yavne, in Jamnia? And then you have the rejection of the Septuagint because it is the variant of the Bible that existed. Remember, the letters written by the epistles, or the epistles written by the apostles, are just being penned. There is no New Testament at this point. There is only the Old Testament, and the Old Testament was the Septuagint. Okay? And the emergent apostolic churches used the Septuagint. And so now you have, especially when you move from 70 AD into 132 AD, and the Bar Kokhba revolt, right, which is kind of the final nail in the coffin between the Jews that followed Yeshua and the Jews who rejected Yeshua. The Jews who rejected Yeshua said, we've got the Messiah, here he is, it's Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiva says he's the Messiah. And those that were Jewish followers of Yeshua said, we cannot partner with you in this because you are telling us that this is the Messiah when it is not. The Messiah, the only Messiah there is Yeshua. And so you literally have this split between the two groups.
Where was the revolt?
It wasn't the city. It was the entirety of Judea. And they kicked the Romans out, and of course the Romans come back with a vengeance. Bar Kokhba is the general who is leading the revolt, and he's the one that around which everybody is centering. Remember, there's two views of the Messiah in Old Testament. There's the Messiah that's the suffering servant, and there's the Messiah that is the ruling king. Bar Kokhba fit that bill from the perspective of the Jews that had rejected Christ, of that Messiah that was going to be the ruling king. And so they said, here he is. He's here. He's going to establish us, and we just need to get behind him. And of course, it all goes horribly wrong, and the diaspora begins in that time frame, right? At the end of the 132 AD, once the Bar Kokhba revolt is put down, Jews are no longer allowed into Jerusalem. They are literally transported out. Most of them are killed, but those that are left are transported out and seeded across the world with the idea that if we sprinkle them here, sprinkle them there, they will have no community by which they can maintain their cultural identity. They'll bleed into the rest of the cultures and they'll be gone. That was the final solution of the Romans in 132 AD to answer the Jewish question. Okay? And my suggestion is that it is actually a combination of these things. I think it's the bottom three that makes the most sense to me. This is my guess. Be really clear about that. But I think that those three things are likely to be the reason why we don't see them in the Masoretic text. So, and again, we're just constraining ourselves to the book of the Maccabees because we're looking at the Maccabean revolt. So what do we have? We have 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are generally accepted by the groups that accept deuterocanonical books as being deuterocanonical. You also have those that are seen to be non-canonical, which are 3rd Maccabees. 3rd Maccabees is considered canonical by some groups, and 4th Maccabees, which is not considered to be canonical by hardly anybody. Okay, and we'll get into the reasons for that shortly. There was a 5th Maccabees, and the early church leaders talk about it. They don't quote out of it. They don't tell us what it said, and there are no extant copies of the 5th book of the Maccabees in existence. So we know it was there, but we don't know what it says, so we can't really say too much about it. All right. So We have groups that think these are inspired scripture. We have groups that think that some of them are not inspired scriptures. And the Protestants consider all of them non-canonical, non-inspired. Okay? But again, in some of the claims that they have made being that these books are not quoted, and now we got to broaden ourselves back to all of the deuterocanonical books, are not quoted in the New Testament, is patently false. They are evenly quoted in the New Testament, 340 versus 332. That's about as close to 50-50 as you can get. Okay. Well, let's talk about 3rd Maccabees first, because 3rd Maccabees predates the Maccabean revolt by 20 years, and it is set in Egypt. Okay, some of the themes of 3rd Maccabees absolutely show up in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. You have an Egyptian ruler, one of the Ptolemies, who decides that doesn't like the Jews, and he is going to see to their destruction. And so you have all of these things that are done to them to try to stamp them out, and eventually, miraculously, they survive this, and another ruler comes in and stops the carnage. So 3rd Maccabees, if you wanted to put them in chronological order, ought to be 1st Maccabees, okay, because it predates the Maccabean revolt. Okay, well, what about 1st, 2nd, and 4th Maccabees? Notice carefully that 1st and 2nd Maccabees has a Star of David on it, and that the 4th Maccabees has a Greek laurel and a Greek column. Okay? Well, when we look at the time frame over which the Septuagint was written, it is under the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who sometime between, and he reigns from 285 to 246 BC, and somewhere towards the end of his reign, we think it's somewhere between 249 and 246, he passes an edict and says, I want the Jewish books translated into Greek. The name of the Septuagint comes from the fact that they literally went over and took 70 scholars, they put them into 70 different rooms, and they had them translate Torah. Not all of the writings, but they started with Torah. And all 70 of these guys translated the Torah identically. So that starts the process, but the process for writing for the Septuagint doesn't come to an end until 132 BC. So from, we'll just call it 246 BC down to 132 BC, we have this process of the writings being translated, and upon the close of 132, the Septuagint as we know it and have seen it exists in its state that it would exist in going forward. Recognize that within that, the time frame of the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes is 175 to 164 BC. The Maccabean revolt is also inside this timeline from 167 to 160 BC. And then from there going forward, from 167 down to 63 BC, the Hasmonean dynasty rules the Jews. And of course, that comes to an end in 63 BC when the Romans take power. So part of the issue here that I think everybody should have, as much as I like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, is the fact that it's written inside of the time frame that the Septuagint is being written. And there you can make the charge that I don't know how you counter that there's going to be a strong inclination to include these books about the freedom of the Jews, wresting their freedom from the Sadducees, right? When the Septuagint is being written, and are they truly inspired or are they not? And that's going to be a tough charge to answer, and that is the reality of it. All right. So again, third Maccabees, if we kind of put these into order, occur about 20 years before the Maccabean revolt. First and second Maccabees gets written shortly after the Maccabean revolt or during the tail end of it. And the fourth Maccabees, again with that Greek laurel and Greek column, giving you a strong indication as to what its leanings are, gets written also in that time frame. So if we look at these and say, okay, how should we understand these four books of the Maccabees? You can take 1, 2, and 3 and lump them together, and if you wanted to give a quick synopsis of it, it's Shema unto God. Hear his voice and do that which he is asking you to do. Unfortunately, book number 4 is a mixture of Greek philosophy and Jewish understandings. And it's this attempt to combine the two and to bring them together in a form of what we would call syncretism, where we're taking the ideas of the Greeks and the ideas of the Jews, and we want to bring them together and maybe take the best of both worlds. Think the Unitarian Church, when you think of that in today's era, right? And come up with something that may be a little better than either two alone, right? We see this in the time of the Maccabees, right? Not that they were following this, but this book gets pinned in that time frame and is included in the Septuagint. But we also see it in the time of Philo of Alexandria, who John, the Apostle John, you can cross compare, and much of what he is saying is pointed at what Philo was doing and saying about taking the ways of the Greeks and meshing them together and coming up with a universal understanding of God that incorporates all of that. And he's saying, nope, that ain't it. Right? That's what the Gospel of John, that preamble particularly, but the entirety of the Gospel is pointing to. All right. So again, that fourth Maccabees is syncretism. It is that combination of Greek philosophy and understanding of God, where they're trying to combine the two to come up with something. And a good reason that one should not be included as inspired text, because I can tell you right now, our God is a jealous God, and he does not want to have his ways diluted. Remember, Deuteronomy chapter 12 says, do not worship me in the ways that the pagans worship, right? Or do not serve me in the ways that the pagans worship or serve. Because the words actually serve there, not worship. All right, so I like this little Hanukkah because it's got the little Maccabee guys hanging out there. The Maccabean revolt, and we're gonna get into more details about the Maccabean revolt next time, just because it's a longer conversation in and of itself. But this understanding of the Septuagint is vitally important to understanding why we have certain books in the Bible, why we don't, and where the fight has been over the years between various groups that consider some of these books inspired canon, and other people look at the same books and say, yep, not having it, right? Not going to accept that as being inspired canon. And the question becomes how to understand that. And again, the fact that we have 332 quotes out of these deuterocanonical books in the New Testament, in only 340, so almost 50-50, right, from the accepted Old Testament in the quoted in the New Testament out of the Septuagint. That fact alone means that we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say, well, we're just going to pitch all of these books. I don't have an answer for you as to which ones truly are inspired. You'll have to look at that, and like anything and everything else, we should filter everything through the Old Testament, right? And if it disagrees with the Old Testament, then we need to kind of set that aside and say, I'm not sure that this portion of what I'm reading can be reconciled with the Old Testament, so therefore we're going to look at that with eschewance, and doesn't mean that there may not be benefit there, right? Even the Jews look at these Maccabean books and say these books are useful, but they don't consider them inspired by God, right? And that being the difference. All right, so some of the themes that we're going to look at next time have to do with what occurs within the Maccabean revolt. And choose this day whom you shall serve, right? That's the quote out of Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. And everybody wants to quote, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, right? But there, you ought to read the context of what else is being said there, because there's a much broader context that people seem to forget. You have this idea that you are commanded, you must do what God has commanded. And again, we would best understand that by shmawing unto the voice of Adonai your God, and then by faith pouring out your will to do that which God has called you to do. This is that concept of the Nesek. Again, chapter 2 of Leviticus, the Menha and the Nesek are brought together, right? They are part of that covenantal meal, and the Nesek represents the pouring out of one's will to accomplish fully the covenant, okay, which Christ does for us. He is that present. It's the concept of the world trying to stamp out the ways of God, right? Another question of what do we do with the Jews? What do we do with this God who says that he is over all things, and we reject him? What are we going to do about it? The world has an answer for that, and you see that played out. Recognize that within the Judean landscape, that we end up with two groups of people. There are those that are Hellenizers, and they embrace the Greeks and Hellenism. They tend to be the upper class and the city dwellers. Same dichotomy that we see today between people who live in cities and think that they know best as to how the rest of the world should run, right? And those that were the Hasidic Pharisees, the pious ones. These are the ones who are spread across the rest of Israel. They represented the lower classes. They tended to be rural folks, and they tended to live by what the Bible said to do. And you end up with this difficulty. They are smawing onto Adonai, and people who listen to what God says to do and then do it tend to be an irritant to those who reject God, or even to those that may not think they're rejecting God, but are not going to do that which God has said to do. Right? This is why even amongst our Christian brothers and sisters, you will have such a vehemence against Messianic believers. Because we look at Scripture and we say, okay, you can see plainly here that Scripture says that we are still to be practicing the things that God has said to do. How that works out is tough, but it's there in Scripture. And there's no amount of hand-waving at it that allows you to just say, nope, done. We can reject all of that, and because Christ did away with it. Well, in fact, you cannot make that argument from New Testament or from Old Testament, except when you take pieces of Scripture out of context. But if you look at the context, you won't be able to support it. So we end up being an irritant to those people, right? So the folks that were seeking to do that which God had said to do were keeping the Moedim. They were keeping the kosher laws. They were doing the Shemitah. And they put their faith in God and not in men. And you can look at what the Hellenizers were doing, and they put their faith in man instead of God. This will come back to bite the Hasmoneans or the Maccabeans in the tail with the last son who does not trust God enough but makes a treaty with Rome, which will eventually lead to the downfall of Jewish rule in Israel. That we'll come to next week. So this culture class literally is of biblical proportions. We have the theme of Antiochus Epiphanes as a type of the Antichrist. And we'll look at all of these themes next week because it's going to take us a full class and maybe a little more to get through them. But we're going to go through the history of what's occurring there, the history leading up to the Maccabean revolt. We're going to look somewhat at the book of Daniel because it describes this. Recognize that the charge has been for the book of Daniel and for some of the other books of the Maccabeans as having been written after the fact, particularly the book of Daniel. And the reason that they say it was written after the fact is because it matches so well, it's so accurate on what occurs within history. And so the charge is that it had to have been written after history had occurred in order for it to accurately predict what was going to happen in the future, right? We live in a time frame where the majority of scholars who study the Bible and they have two levels of what they consider things that will support their arguments. They have anything outside of the Bible, and that holds a huge amount of weight to them. They have their scriptural, textual, critical analysis, right, which also holds a lot of weight for them. This is where they come to the conclusion that there's 4 different authors of Torah, of the first 5 books of the Bible, right? It's really hard to track that argument down as to what that is based upon, right? But it literally is based upon the premise that things will evolve over time, right? And this came into play after we have Charles Darwin promulgating survival of the fittest, right? And this idea that all of nature evolves over time. And they literally were taking that evolutionary hammer and beating all of society with it. And the biblical scholars also picked it up and said, well, this is how the Bible has to be because we don't really believe in a God. And so therefore it had to evolve over time. And so what they said was that the oldest part of the Bible would be that part in which everybody does what is right in their own eyes. So the book of Judges was deemed to be the oldest part of the Bible. And then from there, they looked at it as to, well, how rigid, how many rules are you seeing? And then they would age it according to that, with the idea that it would go from everybody gets to do whatever the heck they please to a very rigid final form. And that's how they came up with this concept that there were going to be 4. And it's really hard to find that argument. And the argument at face value has been addressed many times by many different scholars, showing that whereas Judges quotes these other parts of Torah, right, that are deemed to be supposedly newer, right, but these never quote Judges, right? The quotations would have to come by what is in existence. You would quote that which is in existence. And so they can't make the arguments very well. So the claim for much of, and this is why when the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they came up with these scrolls, and particularly they had almost a complete copy of the book of Isaiah and a number of them, they said, ha, we got you now. We got the smoking gun. We're going to be able to show that what's in our Bibles today does not match the book of Isaiah. But again, it did, right? And part of that comes down to how the Jews reproduced their scrolls, right? And very, very careful, very, very detail-oriented. And there's lots of rules as to how they do that, even today, right? But what we see in those scrolls that came out of the Dead Sea Scrolls was that they all agreed with each other, again, with some very minor exceptions, and most of those exceptions not altering what the word meant, but altering a vowel, right? An aleph or a ayin, something of that nature. So we'll look at themes out of the Maccabean Revolt next week. I want to talk real quickly about Hanukkah to get people kind of to a little bit of an understanding about what's being done and why we do some of the things that we do. The question always comes up, well, isn't a Hanukkah just a menorah? And the menorah technically is patterned after the lampstand of God. It has 7 branches, right? And there are some significant differences between the Hanukkah and the menorah. Notice that the 7-branched menorah, that all of the lights are at the same level, right? In the Hanukkah, we have one that is elevated above, right up in here. It's above the level of the others, and that's deemed to be the servant, right? But you don't have a servant in the menorah itself. That servant is used to light the other 8 candles at their appropriate times. And you have all kinds of different ways that the Hanukkahs are made. There's a lot of artwork, a lot of thought, a lot of ingenuity that goes into those, a lot of fun for this time of year to make those. But again, these are not the lampstand of God. They are a 9-branch menorah as opposed to a 7-branch menorah, which was the lampstand of God. We have Hanukkah understood as the Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Lights. One of the interesting things that comes out of the first and second book of Maccabees is this poor understanding of Sukkot as being an 8-day festival. Remember, we have Sukkot, which the Bible says is 7 days, and right at the tail end of that, we have a completely different appointment, which is Shemini Atzeret, the great 8th day, right? The two of them are not together, but in fact, part of the rationale that you see in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you see nothing about the miracle of the oil in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, or even in 4th or 3rd and 4th Maccabees. Have no idea about 5th Maccabees. It actually dates to a time frame much later. But what you do see is them saying, writing to the Jews in Alexandria and saying, celebrate with us in this time frame, starting at the 25th of Kislev, which was the day that the temple was desecrated, and several years later, the day that the temple was rededicated. Right? That's why this is the Feast of Dedication. They were rededicating the temple. It's important that we understand that the Hanukkahs are used strictly for observance of Hanukkah. We don't use them at other times of the year. And it's understood now to be the commemorating of the miracle of the 8 nights, where they didn't have enough oil to light the 7-branch menorah for the time frame needed, and a cruse of oil would last basically 24 hours. Well, the process of making the oil for the lamp took 8 days. And so they found in the midst of all the rubble and all the cleaning that they had to do of the temple to remove the pig entrails and the pig blood, and to get everything back to a state where they could begin that process of worship again, they found one cruse of oil that supposedly goes all the way back to the time frame of Samuel. And it was only going to last 1 day, but it had Samuel's seal on it. And in faith, they distributed the oil into the 7 branches of the temple lampstand and lit it. And the menorah continued to stay lit for all of 8 days that it took to prepare the next batch of oil that would be used to continue. Right, that's the story that we have. All right, so you can't use the light of the Hanukkah for any other purpose other than remembrance, and only in this 8 days. And you can't even use it for reading Torah. All right, it is strictly to be used for remembrance. Remember that the shamash or helper is always higher. There is no shamash in our 7-branch menorah. And sometimes there are individuals who sometimes misspeak and say that there is, but there is not. Okay, those 7 are at the same level. The helper is used to kindle the other lights. And on Erev Shabbat, the lights are kindled with prayers before the kindling of the light. I've got a copy of some prayers that are typically said. If people want to get a copy of that, we can make copies of them. There are different ways that this is understood in the Talmud. There were 3 options for lighting the Hanukkah candles. Law required only 1 light each night per household. A better practice in the Talmud says to light 1 light each night for each member of the household. And the most preferred practice is to vary the number of lights each night. So you even within the Talmud, you will see different ways of doing things. Typically today, in Sephardic families, the head of the household will light the candle, and Ashkenazic families, those from the Eastern European time frame, all the family members light. Oftentimes they will have their own Hanukkahs, and they'll be lighting their own. The kids especially, I find, like to do that. All right, let's see if I can get that off of there. So when we place the candles, Shamash goes in first, and then we place the candles as we're looking at the Hanukkah from the front, from right to left, but they're lit from left to right day by day. So you would just replace them as you go. And I think you all can get that, so I'm going to move on to the next slide rather than go through all 8 days. At least I'm going to try to. So how many candles do you need? It's going to be 44, right? And most packages of candles that are sold actually give you an extra, and they'll give you 45 candles. That way, if you break one, which happens. So placement of the Hanukkah, you're supposed to place it where it can be seen. And from the Talmud also it says, except in times of danger, like when you're being persecuted, the lights would be placed outside one's door on the opposite side of the mezuzah, or in the window closest to the street. Rashi noted in Shabbat 21b, says their purpose is to publicize the miracle. The blessings of the Hanukkah lights are discussed in the tractate for Sukkah. And here's one in Jerusalem, where of course all the buildings have to be made out of stone by edict. The prayers, I have these prayers, so I'm not going to go through them. If you want a copy of them, let me know, and I can get you a copy of them. The American celebration of Hanukkah, from Zionism to consumerism, follows the path of the American celebration of Christmas, from Christology to commercialism. And of course, we have all these admiral statements to keep the Christ in Christmas, but the reality has been that much of this has been commercialized. The same thing is true for Hanukkah. The vast majority of Jews are variably religious. Many of them are not very religious. They're more cultural Jews, and so this is a fun holiday to keep. All right, and so you will see things like combinations of Christmas trees and Hanukkahs, particularly in families that celebrate both. But I like this card that somebody put out that says, "Keep the Hasmonean in Hanukkah." So the commercialization of Christmas really is a fairly relative advent. 1906 is when all of that kind of starts and really becomes full-blown here in the last 20, 30 years. 2019, 91 new Christmas-themed movies were released. In 2020, it was 75. I could not find a firm number for 2021 because they were breaking it out from Netflix and Hallmark, and there were about 7 different places, and I didn't want to go through the time of writing them up. 2022, there were 171 new movies released with Christmas themes because that's how popular Christmas is. But the Hasmonean revolt, the Maccabean revolt, really has something to do more with God than it does anything else. But even within the Jewish communities, we now have Mensch on a bench, mirroring the elf on a shelf. We have this push to kind of make it a more of a family-themed, Christmas-like sort of extravaganza. Traditional foods for Hanukkah include foods that are cooked by oil. You have your dreidels, of course. You have your latkes and other variants of potatoes that are made. I've got some recipes if you have interest in that. We have a video that I'm not going to show that is put out by the Maccabees. I love the Maccabees. They're really fun. They got some great stuff having to do with Hanukkah. Depending on whether you're Eastern Europe or whether you're from other places, how you make your potato pancakes, whether they're sliced or whether it's mashed potatoes, makes a difference. I've got a recipe for curried sweet potato latkes and blitzes. Citrus vanilla blitzes especially are good, and the sufganiyot donuts with fruit fillings in them. The Sephardic Greeks have a different variant of donuts. All of these are fried foods. Okay. And again, I've got some recipes for that kind of stuff if you have some interest. So next week we're going to look at the Maccabean revolt and go through the history leading up to that, so that we can understand what was occurring within the world that leads to this Maccabean revolt. Again, one of the key features here is we get this really strong dichotomy between what's occurring in the rural communities, those that are seeking to follow after the ways of Adonai, and those that are in the city that are literally abandoning worship on the Temple Mount to go down and strip their clothes off and to wrestle and to participate in the other games. They built a gymnasium right below the Temple Mount. And when the sound would start for the games to begin, for people to gather for that, the priests were stripping off their robes and going down to participate in these things. And we have accounts of the fact that people were figuring out how to reverse their circumcision in order to be like the Greeks. They wore their hair like the Greeks. They wore their clothes like the Greeks. And again, we just end up in this cultural dichotomy between those that are seeking to do that which God has said to do, and those that are seeking to be of the world, in the world, and doing the things of the world, and find abhorrent the things of God. All right? That will come into play in what we hear from Hannah and the 7 martyrs, her 7 sons that get martyred, in how they understand why they are going through the things that they're going through. Likewise with Eliezer, I think it is, who gets martyred as well. So we will look at all those things next week. And if you have questions about Hanukkah, reach out to me. Be glad to entertain them as best I can. And I think as we enter into this season of Hanukkah, it is and can be a really family-oriented time frame. We try not to make it like Christmas, right? And I would just say that understanding why we do things and what miracles occur during this time frame. You literally have people who are rural farmers with pitchforks initially and farming implements going up against some of the crack troops of the time and winning, right? And of course, they're accumulating more in the form of shields and swords and pikes and things that they need to conduct it. But they're still, the numbers that they are facing are just overwhelming. And time again, they're able to defeat a foe that is coming at them with so much more than they can bring to the field. And yet, you know, that's a God thing, right? So we'll pick that up next week, and I will see you then. Shalom.